I won't say much because we introduced him well yesterday, and I know you're eager to hear more from him. I want to welcome back to the stage Bishop Mike Rinehart for the next keynote. Welcome, Bishop Mike. Okay.
You are the light of the world. You are the light of the world. Are we good? Okay, you are. You know what? Let's say thank you to the camera people, the tech people, the light people in the back corner there. Doing a great job. You know, they wear black clothes. They're back behind that black area over there, kind of hidden back there. It's hard to see them, but they're making so much of this happen. So we appreciate you back there. You are the light of the world. A city set upon a hill cannot be hidden. Nobody takes a lamp and lights it and hides it under a bushel basket. Instead, you put it on a lampstand so that it will give light to the whole house. Therefore, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. That lamp may be your faith, but the light that it gives off are the good works that bless the communities in which we all live together. So I've got a new call and response for your congregation. I'll say, the Lord light up your life, and you respond, and up yours too. Okay, let's try it, right? The Lord light up your life. Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. So the other day, Bishop Moss was, he visited a congregation, and he was walking down the aisle with the pastor, and there was only a couple of people on one side and maybe 3 people on the other side. And Bishop Moss leaned over to the pastor and said, didn't you tell anyone I was coming? And the pastor said, no, but apparently someone did. Oh, it's good to laugh. It's good to get started with laughter. I want to say thank you for the warm welcome that you've given me, and all the conversations that we have had during the breaks and so on and so forth, and the conspiring about how we grow our gardens and our faith communities that are blessings to the towns and villages in which we live. I apologize that we did run out of books, and a number of you came up and said, what do I do? And I said, you can get them on, just type my name in. I only wrote 1 book, so it's not hard to find. And there's also a link on my blog, as I promised. I did a blog post on the assembly here with a couple of pictures and updates and things like that, and there's probably a link to it in there as well. I'm deeply grateful for Connie's guided meditation as we were talking about prayer. I think there's a chapter in the book on guided meditation. That was really meaningful to me, and I'm going to steal that. I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to use that. I really appreciate it. I also appreciated today, Brian, of all of your report. One of the things that really impacted me was the self-implicating way that you talked about race. And when we talk about race, if we do so from a bully pulpit, where we're pointing at others for what they're doing wrong, it doesn't come off well. But when we can talk about the fact that I too have made racist remarks and participated in a society that gives benefits to some and not others, that kind of self-implicating behaviors, it's humble and it really hits home, and that hit me strongly. Let's begin with prayer. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the privilege of being part of this beautiful garden that you created, this world. We thank you for the privilege of being able to plant our gardens in our congregation, that they might bear fruit that will bless all your people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I got on a plane to Mexico City because I was going to Peru, our companion synod, and I took Air Mexico, so I had to change planes in Mexico City, and I ordered the flight late, so I ended up in a middle seat, and I hate sitting in the middle seat because I'm tall, not as tall as Bishop Moss. Is anybody? Anyway, and I thought, I don't want to sit in this middle seat. I thought maybe I'll get lucky and there'll be an empty. There were no empty seats. So I got there and I got on there. And when I got to my seat, I saw there was somebody on the aisle and somebody at the window. And these were both really big guys, kind of scary looking guys with tats and earrings and all kinds of stuff. And I thought, oh no. And I sat down in the seat and I kind of sat down in my seat like this. And they both had their arms on the armrest and they were looking at me like, don't even think about it, right? And so I'm sitting here like this and I'm thinking, what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus would talk to them, right? So I leaned over to the one guy and I said, so where are you going? And he said, oh, we're going down to Aruba and we're going to lay on the beach and we're going to drink beer and hunt for women. And then he said, what are you going to do? And of course, I was not wearing a collar. I was incognito. So, but I thought, boy, am I going to ruin his day. And so I said, and he kind of patted this big wad of bills in his pocket for going to do whatever he was going to go do down there. And I said, well, I'm going to Peru. This is our companion synod. I'm a Lutheran pastor, and I'm going down to Peru to participate in a vacation Bible school. We have a bunch of churches from Houston that have a relationship with Lutheran churches in Lima. And Lima is one of the poorest cities. At the time it was. It's doing better now, but in South America, where 70% of the children live under the poverty level. And we're going to do this vacation Bible school for 500 children in the heart of Lima. And this is the best week of my year. And I am so excited about that. I kind of go on and on. I'm an extrovert, as you probably figured out. And you don't want to sit next to me on an airplane, right? You know, I sit down and you see them put their earphones in usually like that. But I talked to this guy about Peru for the longest time, and his friend on the other side was listening too. And they didn't say much. But when we landed, I got up to leave. And as I was getting my bag out of the overhead and started to walk off, he grabbed my arm and he said, wait a second. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out this wad of bills and he just started peeling off $20 bills into my hand and said, I want you to use that for those children in Lima. And it just touched my heart. And I took away two things from that. One is, don't ever count anybody out because of the way you think they look or act or assume what they think. And this guy who's going down to Aruba to do God knows what, and yet he has a heart for the children of Lima. After something in him resonated with that. Something in him is his heart was also broken around the things that break God's heart. And there was something there, and that struck me. The second thing is, whenever God touches our heart, God usually touches our wallets as well too. He knew what to do. He didn't need a lesson on stewardship. When God touched his heart, his immediate response is, I want to be a part of that, and this is a way that I can be a part of that. And so that generosity, I think, naturally flows from when hearts are touched. And I think that's probably that part of the essence of planting our gardens together. And so I really want to think about that as we move forward. Now I'm going to continue. Some of you came up and said, what about the rest of the garden? I said, don't worry, we're talking tomorrow. We'll get to it. And we will. So yesterday we talked about beginning with prayer, individually, but also as a group, that we bathe everything in prayer and worship and song, so that we aren't acting out of impulse or out of fear, but instead out of a sense of joy and calling in our giftedness in Christ. And then we talked about planting, and we talked about how fragile the plants are at first, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We talked about ways to invite, ways to draw a crowd. We talked about the fact that 80% of the people that you invite to church statistically will say yes and participate. So we need to become more. Oh yes, that's right. I was telling Miriam that how it was. Wow, lovely. And I want to say that as we come out of this pandemic, and I really do believe that we are coming out of it, that this does not the church's first rodeo. This may be your first global pandemic or not, but unless you were around in 1918 for the so-called Spanish flu, which actually started in Kansas. How we like to blame other people and so forth. But every 100 years there's a global pandemic, and it's been going back for a long time. In the 2nd century, the Antonine plague, they believe, killed off as much as a fourth of the Roman Empire. And yet the church grew because the church preached not about a God who was punishing people with a plague for their sins, like we often like to hear every time there's a hurricane in New Orleans. That's all we hear about is God punishing New Orleans for Mardi Gras, Instead, those Christians preached about a God who loves us even in the midst of a broken creation, and the church grew. In the 3rd century, they had the Cyprian plague, which was named after a 3rd century bishop named Cyprian. And Bishop Moss, you've done a great job here, but you've arrived as a bishop when they name a plague after you, all right? So not quite there yet. The plague of Cyprian, Cyprian said that the Christians served those who were in need, and especially taking care of others as well too. And Cyprian said, don't worry so much about those who've died and gone to heaven because of the plague, but instead focus your time caring for the living on earth. It was an opportunity for the church to make its mark. Bishop Dionysius described the work of churches like this: heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need. And why not? Because that's what Jesus' ministry was, right? He went out there and he saw a need and he addressed it. He saw lepers and he was drawn to where those needs really are. I went and saw Kirby John Caldwell talk one time, and he said, make a list of the top 10 needs of your community on the left side of the page, and on the right side of the page, make up a ministry that addresses that need. That's ministry. That's it. You don't need a theology degree to do. That's what Jesus did to do ministry. So make a list of the top 10 needs of your community. Pick 3 of them that resonate with you, because maybe you have gifts in your congregation to address these needs, and then go after them. And that is your letting your light shine in the community. That will be your best evangelism program. When we go and visit the Central African Republic, one of our companion synods, the thing that that impresses me is they don't separate evangelism from social ministry. They don't see them as 2 separate things. They're the same thing. When you ask them about their evangelism program, they start talking about infant mortality rate in their community, because that is their evangelism. They start talking about the Fulani Muslim cattlemen who need help. And this has had a profound effect. And in fact, a number of the Fulani have converted over to Christianity. They've been impressed by this, and they oftentimes get disowned by their family. And so the church, when they get baptized, the church has to bring cattle to the table in order to help these people get by. They see baptism as a huge commitment. They connect those 2 together. So what are the top 10 needs of your community? So one of the things we talk a lot about is doing a tune-up or tune-in to your community. Listen deeply. Go meet with the mayor. Go meet with the city planner. Go meet with the school principals. Go meet with the public defender. Go meet with the local police or sheriff or whatever it is you have here in Nebraska, and find out what's going on in the community. Do some deep listening. Do that before you do as a part of your prayerful planning. Because I've seen, and I've been a part of, strategic planning processes in congregations that go like this. You get a bunch of people together in the fellowship hall. Well, what do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? Let's get new carpet. Right? It's a mile wide and an inch deep. But if you start with listening to your community, the top needs of your community, and then all of a sudden you discover that you've got, latchkey kids across the street. Maybe you need an after-school program for the school that's right across the street. When you have those kinds of conversations going on, that will deepen your whole process that's part of your prayer process. So I want to encourage you to make that a high priority. All right, where was I? Third century, Dionysius. 4th century, There was also a plague. The Emperor Julian complained that the Galileans, which is what he called Christians, the Galileans cared not only for their own, but they also cared for non-Christians. And so the church historian Rodney Stark said that because of this, the death rate in Christian cities was half that of pagan cities. The church, what I want to say is that we do not need to see the pandemic as the death knell. In fact, it could be the beginning of an opportunity for the church to be the church. In 1527, when the bubonic plague hit Wittenberg, Luther said, "I ask God to mercifully protect us, and then I will fumigate. I will purify the air, I will administer medicine, and I will take it. I will avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order to not become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others, and so cause their death as a result of my negligence." God, speak, Luther. If God should wish to take me, he will certainly find me. And I have done what is expected of me, so I'm not responsible for either my death or the death of others. And by the way, today is June 4, which is the day that Luther said that Copernicus was a madman trying to turn the world upside down. He said that this Polish astronomer, this is in Table Talk, 1539, that he said that Copernicus thinks that the sun doesn't move, that the earth instead moves around the sun. This is just craziness. This is crazy talk. But what's interesting is they were both kind of in a similar project. Because while Copernicus was decentering the earth from the universe, was decentering Rome from the church and the world in many ways. And so we're part of that legacy. We have an opportunity now to rethink who we are as a people and who we are as a church together. Okay, so 3 water, yeah, that's right. So we talked about planting. Now I want to talk about a couple of other things. Watering, I want to talk about watering as the warm welcome. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think we don't do this exceptionally well. Because what I was saying yesterday is drawing a crowd is not going to be your problem. Getting a group of people to come is not your problem. You just put a sign out in front that says free beer, right? So that, but once they come, what happens to them when they show up is ultimately what matters, because that's part of you are growing faith life in people. So what happens when they show up? How are they treated by others? I went and visited a church when I was on vacation a couple of years ago. It was a Lutheran church in another synod. I showed up. You couldn't park at the front door because there was no parking on the street, but you went around to the back. I parked in the parking lot. I came in the first door I saw. I came in. There was a group of people standing over here in a crowd. They looked at me and then went back to their conversation. I walked in that building. Again, nobody said hello, kind of like the church that I was talking about yesterday. And I think this happens more often than we like. And so this kind of effusive welcome. Now, if I go to the non-denominational church in my town, there are golf carts running around, picking up people, taking them to the front door because it's a pretty big parking lot. And especially if it's raining, because in Texas, when it rains, you never get these light mists like we got in Michigan. It just comes down like God has taken a bucket of water and just kind of poured it on top of you like that. And you go 20 feet to the door and you get soaking wet. So they'll have these golf carts running around picking up people. They have people along the sidewalk that are welcome. We're so glad you're here. People at the doors when you walk in, people at the doors when you go into the auditorium. So maybe we need to learn something from them in the way that we do welcome. And there's probably some of your congregations that do this exceptionally well. So I would challenge the Synod staff, because they get around to different congregations, to figure out what congregations do this warm welcome the best. And what can we learn from them? And maybe we can make them a teaching congregation to help us learn how to extend hospitality. Now, I want you to think for a second about somebody who's come to church, because remember yesterday we were talking about if you come to church, as a visitor who comes to church, there's a high probability that they're in some kind of crisis. Maybe they've just moved, and moving can be stressful. Or maybe they've just left their other church because of a conflict, or maybe they're divorced and they can no longer go to their church because they're trying to create some separation from their spouse, or maybe they haven't been to church in a long, long time. What made them decide to come to church that Sunday? What is going on in their life that made them want to come right now? So they are vulnerable, they're nervous, they're walking in the door, they don't know if they're going to feel welcome. Think about it, if you were going to go visit a Mormon church. Yeah, do you know what to expect? Do you know if you're going to be welcome? How will you be welcome? So on and so forth. That's how a lot of people view our churches. Or if you're going to visit a mosque, will you know what to do? Will somebody tell you, yes, please take off your shoes? Do they separate the men from the women? I visited a Russian Orthodox adopting our daughter. And Susan and I were standing there in this service, and this woman came over to she stood probably about this high. She was really short, and she tugged at my leg, and I was like, "What's going on right here?" And I couldn't understand what she was saying to me. But she started pointing the other side, and Susan said, "Oh." All the women were on one side, and the men were on another side, and I was on the women's side where I was not supposed to be, and she was trying to let me know. So what are the rules of your church, spoken and unspoken, and how are we going to impress the visitors when they come in if they don't do it right? How do we help them do it right? Are we crafting worship in a way that is friendly to those who are new to the church? Are we choosing our music on the basis of needs of those who are already there or those who are yet to come? Because I oftentimes, when I was parish pastor, I'd have people come up to me and say, "How come you're not singing this hymn?" They wanted their hymn sung. So we would find a way to sing their hymn, but their focus, their lens was on, this is worship for me. But what if we're saying our worship is not for me, our worship is for them? And then in making worship for them, it will become a blessing to me as well, too, as we enjoy finding people who are welcomed into this garden that we are creating together. So are the hymns chosen for those who are not yet here but are coming? Is the liturgy crafted in that way? Is the bulletin crafted in that way? Is the sanctuary appointed in such a way that visitors are made to feel welcome and not ushered to the front pew? Those are all the kinds of things you got to think about. It. Every church architecture is different. Every town is different. You've got to figure out how to do that in your place. But it really means that evangelism becomes the work of the whole church, including the property committee, making sure that the grounds look nice and are accessible, including the worship team. Everybody is doing this project, not just some evangelism committee that's out there doing it. Greeters at every door. People will decide whether they are coming back to your church in the first 5 to 10 minutes. Any realtors out there? So people decide whether they're going to buy a house usually by the time they walk through the front door. That's why they say the front door has to look nice, the front yard has to look nice, the foyer has to look nice, because usually they'll make that decision. Same thing in churches. They will make that decision in the first 10 minutes before you even get to the sermon. So the evangelists are the ushers and greeters and worship leaders and the people that are there beforehand. So important that I stopped greeting after the service at one point in my last parish, and I started greeting beforehand so that I could stand out on the front porch and get to meet people as they were coming in. Very important ministry. Clear directions to the nursery, to the bathrooms, how to take communion. Tell me what to expect. Don't hide the fellowship hall. The fellowship in some room. In my last church, the fellowship hall was in a different building. And people had to walk past their car to get to the fellowship if they knew where it was, if they could find it, if they read it in the bulletin. And so we ultimately, and our narthex was too small, so we ultimately started putting coffee and iced tea out on the front porch of the church, because you've got to catch people before they get to the parking lot. Otherwise, they're in their car and they're gone, and you'll never get a chance to meet them. And so how do we then recognize who is new? Well, you may not be able to if your church is large. If you're small, you can probably figure out who the newbies are. But if your church is large, then everybody just has to be friendly to everybody, and not just to their buds. And that's something that has to be taught. It has to be talked about from the pulpit. It has to be taught in small groups. How do we become a welcoming community? Because you know how it is. You walk into the community and you may not know who's new and who's not, and you're worried about how I'm going to fit in, rather than thinking to yourself, they're pretty nervous too. How do I make them feel comfortable and welcome? And who are the people who have that spiritual gift of hospitality, who will go around and identify newcomers? And that makes a huge difference. If you visit a church And somebody would come in and they'd come out and I'd say, "Hey, nice to meet you." And what do you do? "Oh, I'm a pilot and we're new to the area." "Ah, well, I know that there are 2 or 3 pilots in our congregation, and so I'm looking around to see if they're." And I'm like, "What, Jeff? Over here, come on," and connect them together. Or, "I've got kids that go to this school. Let's connect them to it." And all of a sudden, they're making friends, they're making connections, and they really feel like that there's a community that loves them and cares about them. I've already talked about stealth greeters. We had a single mom that came to one of the churches that I served, and she joined the church. And I asked her, "Why did you join this church?" And she said, "Well, I'm a single mom and with 2 kids, and I visited 10 churches, and this is the only church that didn't ask me where my husband was." Wow. Okay. Because that could have happened at our church too. It just didn't that Sunday. So I'm grateful for that. And she said, I felt welcome here just as I am and not judged. And that had a huge impact on her. It's those little things. It's not just what the pastor or the leader's saying. Is how are we training the entire community to be a welcoming force? And I think that's making it a priority and talking about it and encouraging people and teaching people how to do that. Now, I think the watering then extends to what happens after they visit. And everything I've read said you want to make contact with these folks 24 to 48 hours after they visit, after somebody has a first-time visit. And that takes a little bit of organization. In a small congregation, which reading your statistics from the practice vote, you're like we are. In Texas, 88% of people live in metropolitan areas, but 60% of our congregations are in rural and small town areas, because they were all planted during an agrarian era, right? So we have a lot of really small churches. In fact, 2/3 of our churches have less than 100 in worship. 1/3 of our congregations have less than 50 in worship on any given Sunday. In those churches, the pastor can make that call and probably should, unless you're just really bad at it and then delegate. But here's what that call is. That is not a recruitment call. It is a care call. It is a pastoral care call. In a larger congregation, you're going to have trained lay leaders. And as the congregation I served, as we grew, I started training others to make these calls as well too. But that call is a very simple call. Thank you for worshiping with us. What brought you to First Church today or yesterday or whatever? And let them tell their story. Listen to them. Listen for that pain or that crisis or whatever's going on in their life what brought you to church today. And they will most likely tell you, if they feel like it's a safe conversation, they're going to tell you what's going on in their lives. And they'll look forward to the conversation. And you have an opportunity for ministry. Even if they never come back to your church again, you have an opportunity to be a blessing in their life, to let your light shine, and to bring some joy and hope into their lives. But the odds are, if you bring joy and hope into somebody's life, they're going to want more of that. So that call is a very caring call to listen to what's going on. I've had some of those calls where people have cried on the phone with me. And sometimes that leads to a meeting. Let's have lunch together. Let's talk about what's going on. And then it always ends with, "I would love for you to come back next Sunday. Could we meet up?" Now, if it's a lay person, they might even go sit with them. "I'll meet you. What service are you coming to?" "I'll come. Let's sit together." I mean, that's connecting them with, and then you really start connecting them with the community. I think that call is absolutely critical. When our congregation had 120 worship, I made every single one of those calls. As we grew to 200 and then eventually to 300 worship, I started saying that this is too many calls for me to make effectively, and I started training others to make those calls too. But again, not recruitment calls. Those are pastoral care calls. In fact, it was our care team and our prayer team that made a lot of those calls. "How can I pray for you?" was one of the questions that we would sometimes ask on those calls as well too. Now, in order to make those calls, you have to have a phone number, which means when people come to your church, you have to find out who they are. And that's not always easy. A lot of people like to come in as stealth visitors. They don't want to give their information out necessarily. And that's okay. Let them come. If you can't get their information, you can't get it. But what are some ways that you can get people's contact information if they come and visit your church? Your bulletin asks for a name. And how do they give you that name? There's a tear off in the bulletin. Offering plate? Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, we did something very similar. We even bought perforated bulletin covers so that we could have this on the back. And I love to have a couple of things on there. Tell us your name, and any information they're willing to give us. An email, anything. I'll take anything I can get. Even if I don't have a phone number, if I got an email, I can make contact, right? And we would also have a prayer request in there because that gives us an opportunity. Sometimes they will write down what's going on. Mom just died, or whatever it is that's going on in their life that make them seek out spiritual community on this particular Sunday. Just lost my job, going through a divorce, death in the family. There's something made them seek out. And isn't it beautiful that people still imagine the church to be a place where they can find spiritual comfort and solace? That works in our favor. People are as spiritually hungry and thirsty as they have ever been. And we need to find ways to help them quench that spiritual thirst. Another way, some people still have the visitor book out in front. If you got it, that's fine. Most people will not sign that book or find that book, but it's okay to have that out there. Another way is if they write a check and drop it in the offering plate, and hardly anybody does anymore, but a lot of people still do. If they do, usually you've got contact information on that check, which means that the money counters have to be somehow in contact with the care callers that are making those calls afterwards and say, hey, yeah, we had checks from people we don't know. Here are their names. And here's the contact information that we have. Nowadays, it's easier than ever to find people's contact information. It's called Google. Honestly, I can Google or Facebook a name in a city and almost always get a hit some way or the other. You can usually find people are easier to find than ever before. Thank you for coming. What brought you to our church? How can I pray for you? Would you like to come back next Sunday? Or we're having this big bouncy house at our church on next Sunday. Why don't you come and join us for that? Something along those lines. I think that care call is part of the watering that we do when people come in. It means that you have to have multiple ways of gathering information to provide water for a thirsty soul. Then when they come in, we need to feed. I like Miracle-Gro. I think that's the way to go. How are we going to, once they start coming more than once, how do we then involve them? And I think what we're talking about here is the word. How do we give them some spiritual depth? I love the story of the sower and the seed because, Jesus seems to recognize the complexity of this, that the sower goes out to seed and some of that falls on the path and it gets eaten by birds. And then some of it falls on rocky soil and it immediately shoots out roots. But because it's rocky soil, the roots are shallow, and so as soon as the sun comes out, they wither. I've seen this happen for people who join the church as well too. They come in, they don't have deep roots, and then all of a sudden they get exposed to the dark underbelly of the church. They attend a congregational meeting where people are fighting over something, and the sun comes out and they're scorched. And this is why you have to be careful about involving people in church leadership too early, especially if they're young and they're new and they're all of a sudden they're having this renaissance of faith. They love the music, they love the community. There's something's going on in their life, and then all of a sudden they get exposed to a conflict. Now, I'm not saying conflict is bad. Conflict is a part of life. Conflict is a way that tells you something's not right and we've got to fix this. And everybody's going to have to change a little bit in the midst of this. But how you handle conflict, how people treat one another when a conflict is going on will often determine whether people are going to stick around because they've already got enough conflict in their lives, in their families, at their workplace. They don't need a third place to have more conflict. So how do we then create a community that can learn how to deliberate, to talk with one another in love? And people go, oh, wow, all right, they disagree about this stuff, and yet they can still be human beings with each other. That's beautiful. How do I get that? And then their leaves won't wither. And then finally, there's some of this seed that falls on good soil, and it grows, and you have a harvest. And that's out of 4 different scenarios, only one of them actually bears fruit. So Jesus seems to say 25% of the seeds that you sow might bear fruit. Now, the other 75% not, but that's okay. We just kind of keep going because the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few, as we talked about, Pastor Miriam. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Jesus is always talking about growing seeds, and mustard seeds that start off tiny. That's what the kingdom of God is like. The reign of God is like this tiny seed that can bear incredible fruit if we just water and feed it and allow God to do what God does in the world. Jesus talks about fishing. I'll teach you how to fish for people. Jesus went around and he invited people into discipleship. He invited his disciples to be a part of what's going on in the world. So once they come and they start to get involved, how do we connect them into small groups? How do you get connected to the church? In many of our churches, the way you get connected is by serving on a committee. And then people begin to think that Christianity is about sitting around tables and drinking bad coffee out of styrofoam cups and talking about how to fix the building. And you know what? That's not it. What studies of growing churches show that 90% of people are involved in volunteering and serving ministries, and 10% are involved in administration. In dying churches, 90% of people are involved in administration and 10% are out doing ministry. When people come, most of them don't really want to be on the organization team for the Habitat Project. They want to hammer nails. They want to go out and do that work. How do we help them get involved and not necessarily put them in charge right away, but allow them to serve according to their gifts? How do we discover what those gifts are? Maybe we need to be doing gift surveys a little more often. We used to do that with every new member class. One time I did it in a sermon. I passed them out with a bulletin. And in all 3 services, we did spiritual gift surveys. And then afterwards, we invited people to come to Fellowship Hall and talk about what they discovered and if it's really true or not. And then we captured all of that information so that when we needed somebody for a certain ministry, we'd say, all right, if you're going to be a care caller, calling visitors, what gifts do you need to have? You need to be a good listener. You need to have compassion. We started kind of thinking about that. And we could go through our list in our database of people who identified themselves as having these kinds of gifts. And it gives you a much higher possibility of getting people involved in some kind of ministry. As we said yesterday, they want to make friends. How do we help them find friends? Well, for us, that meant getting them in small groups. A couple of us were talking about that from one of the churches in Omaha yesterday, that small groups are the way that people can connect with friends. So how do we get them in small groups? Well, maybe you need to have some kind of a book study, as we talked about yesterday, going on to connect them. It's hard to connect newcomers to existing groups because the existing groups have shared stories and history, and the newcomer comes in and immediately they can feel that they are not in with that group. So it's easier to create new groups with newcomers. If you can make a new member class, a group, fantastic. If not, how do we then create other kinds? We have to constantly be creating groups in order for people to get connected. I talked to someone yesterday who said that their 40 Days of Purpose group was still meeting like 20 years later, which is kind of amazing. Wow. Good for you. I mean, that's kind of amazing. But we do know how to do this. You have shown great hospitality to me. I'm someone who comes in from the outside and participating here, and people coming up in the hallway and just saying, thank you for being here. It's really nice to have you here. Thanks for coming and being part of it. I mean, you've extended, I felt a warm welcome here. How do we then translate that into Sunday morning? And maybe we practice it with each other, right? So make sure you extend that welcome to one another on Sunday mornings as well too. How do we get people into Bible study? How do we invite them into the Word so that they are fed spiritually and not just coming to be part of a club with a religious theme? And so that's inviting people into spiritual practices like prayer and reading scripture, serving, those kinds of practices. How do we invite them in? How do we teach that in the home? Because remember, the faith was taught in the home a long time before Sunday school was invented in the 18th or 19th century. I can't remember exactly the history in England, where it was basically a ministry to kids on the street. And it became our primary paradigm for Christian education. But before that, it was in the home. Luther wrote the Small Catechism for parents to teach the faith to their children in the home. So how do we get that going on as well, too? And as Bishop Brian was talking about, and we have most of our Sunday schools are struggling, but we have churches that have started Wednesday night school and Sunday night school that have really taken off and done some stuff. How do we help grow faith in our people? Constantly reconnecting them to the Word. People need spiritual sustenance, and they need community. And we learned in the pandemic that they're willing to die for that community. And when people knew that attending church, they they could contract a deadly disease that would take their life, and they had had friends that had died of that disease, and yet they still wanted to come to church. They were so mad, called the pastor and yelled at the pastor for not giving them communion. People were willing to die for community. They're desperate for community. Think about how good it feels to be back together for the first time in 3 years as a synod assembly, and you get a sense of what people are spiritually hungry and thirsty for. They want friends, they want community, they want some depth as well too, and this is something we do. We can offer that. Okay, I'm going to talk about weeding. Somebody asked me about this one. I always put this in here because it's the truth. Church leaders and your church leaders are the immunity system of the organization. And when a community has a weak culture, there will always be people that will try to take advantage of that culture for their own self-aggrandizement. This is just the truth. It's just the way it is. And there are always going to be bullies out there. I was bullied as a kid. This is very personal to me. I had really thick glasses. I was kind of geeky. I was terrible at sports because I couldn't see the ball. And I liked music and dance and those kinds. And I got picked on quite a bit. And there's always going to be a bully. There's always going to be a bully. And if the community doesn't gather around and protect people from the bullies, then your church is going to be controlled by bullies. And it requires leaders to recognize bad behavior and call people out on it and say, we are not going to put up with this. Here are our values as a church. And that's what I mean by weeding. Now, I don't mean that you're going to tear the weeds out and throw them away. We have that story of the wheat and the tares and so forth. But we do need to keep the weeds down, because if you don't keep those weeds, if I don't keep those weeds down, they're starting to sprout up there in the middle. They're going to choke out those marigolds, and I've got some roses off to the left of there too, and I've seen it happen where a vine grows up and it basically kills the plant. We've got to be able to do this. I remember when John Stoll came, we pulled out the front pew of the church. I shouldn't have said a name, sorry. Golly, can you delete that from the live stream? Is that possible? I remember when an unnamed member of the congregation came forward to me because we had pulled out the front pew to make more room for the band because the church was growing, but we had to pull out a pew. It was an awkward thing, but we had to do it, and that's where they sat. It was their pew, and I love John. If this goes live, I want everyone to know I love this member deeply. But he said, "If you take out that pew, I'm leaving this church." And I said, we are going to miss you so much. With as deadpan a face as I possibly could to say, we love you, we want you here, but I'm not going to be bullied in this. We actually took a council vote to remove a pew. But somehow we have to have the higher cause of the church, and that is we're growing, and we need to fan the flames of this growth, and God is doing something here, and we need to be flexible. We need to move things around a little bit, and yeah, that probably means the pew's got to come out. Sometimes we have to make really difficult choices, like pulling out a pew. I wish I could pull them all out and put chairs in, but boy, that would have probably cost me my call at that point in time. Leaders are the immunity system of the organization, and we have to have the courage to say no. No, we are not going to tolerate this. I had another group of people who will remain unnamed who were just constantly bullying people. Somebody would take leadership in an area and they would just go and complain, constantly complain. You're doing it wrong. We don't like this. We don't want these posters up in the narthex. We don't want that. And it was just always just kind of, I don't know if it's a power thing or what do people get out of that? I don't entirely understand it. But I went to the council and I said, what do we do? And they said, well, maybe we need to follow the Bible, and somebody needs to go and talk to that person individually. And then if that doesn't work, we'll take 2 people along. If that doesn't work, we'll have the whole council deal with it necessarily. And I said, okay, who's that one person? They said, you. So I kind of knew how this was going to turn out. So I went over to their house and I said, look, this is the kind of behavior we won't put up with. And I know you're not supposed to end sentences with a preposition, but that's what I said. I think it's a great quote by Winston Churchill, where some editor was correcting all his statements that ended with prepositions, and he wrote on it, "This is the kind of nonsense up with which I will not put." I thought that was really smart. Anyway, I went to their house and I said, "Look, these are the behaviors up with which we will not put." And and I said, I can't have this, and I can't have that, and I can't have this. They didn't even argue with me. They were just furious with me, furious with me. And they went back and they got their keys to the church and their notebooks for whatever committee they were sitting on. They slammed them on the table and they said, "We're leaving this church and we're never coming back." And I said, "We are going to miss you so much." And then they proceeded to go out and tell everyone that the pastor came to their house and kicked them out of the church. And we lost 3 families over it. But guess what? That church got much nicer. It was a funner place to be. And it was much less hard to find volunteers for ministry because there wasn't somebody going out bullying everybody. Your church won't grow if you don't have the courage to say no to people. And I didn't kick them out. I just told them, "We're not putting up with this behavior." They self-selected out. And I still see her in the community, and we greet each other gracefully. But they needed to be somewhere else because they were not functioning in a healthy way for them. It wasn't good for them either. So they found their way to another church, I think, and that's okay. And I used to keep a list of other churches in the area in my pocket. You know, and I'd say, "Look, I understand if you want to belong to a church that believes abortion is always wrong in every circumstance, even if the life of the mother is in jeopardy, then fine. Here's Sacred Heart Catholic. Here's West Conroe Baptist. These are the churches that hold that view." We are not that church. We are a church that wrestles with this. We are a church that struggles in the gray areas of moral decisions, and we believe that we have to deliberate about this morally, and that we shouldn't be bullying people into thinking this or that. We should be a community of moral deliberation. I am watching my clock this time, so I will behave myself. Jesus did not run away from conflict. The rich young ruler went away sad, and Jesus didn't go running after him and say, "Okay, all right, maybe not 100%, give 50%. How about that? How about that? Or okay, 25%. How about 10%?" Jesus was willing to do that, and he wasn't. We're going to keep people at all costs. Sometimes we think we got it because we're desperate to have people. We think we got to keep people at all costs, and that's just not the case. Some people left offended at what Jesus said. I think it was that whole bread of life stuff in John 6 or whatever. And even the disciples came to him and Jesus said, "So are you going to leave too?" And the disciples said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." Jesus said, when they said, "Herod's out to kill you," Jesus said, "Go and tell that fox." And they said, "You should leave town right now." And he said, "Go and tell that fox, I'm preaching today and tomorrow, and maybe on the 3rd day, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, because no prophet dies outside of Jerusalem." He was even willing to speak truth to power, to the political powers around him, and not really worry about what people thought about it and take the costs. Sometimes it's weeding, not weeding, but it's pruning, and it's reining in behavior. We always speak the truth in love. We speak with as much kindness as possible, but we speak firmly, and we say, we aren't going to put up with this stuff. And then I'm going to add another one too, helpers. Everybody needs helpers. These are my helpers. Henry on the left there, he's a good digger. He's a great helper in the garden. Bo, the black one on the right, he's a napper. He's not so much help. Don't try to do it all yourself. And don't try to do everything. Sometimes church things got to have everything. Well, where's your women's ministry? Where's your men's ministry? Where's your... well, you can't just singles ministry. You can't do everything. You got to decide, what are we uniquely gifted to do, and where is God calling us to go? And that gets us back to prayer. And then you've got to pull in as many people as possible to be involved. And that's where the spiritual gifts stuff come in handy. You're going to need helpers no matter what you do. Anything worth doing is going to take a team. Jesus needed a team. You need a team too. And the more people that you can get involved, the more are going to show up. We started a new service. We wanted to build attendance for the service. So we got 3 lectors, 9 ushers, 5 people in the musical group. I mean, so all of their families are going to show up, and all of a sudden you got a service. The more people that you involve in leadership in some way, shape, or form, make sure everybody in your congregation has a job. Figure out what their gifts are. you know, and it may not be singing in the choir, and have the courage to say, this probably isn't your gift. But we have a mowing team, and that's a great ministry. Let me tell you what, our mowers, they'd get together on Saturday morning and they would pray together and they'd read a scripture. It was their small group, and they'd go out and mow, and they loved each other, and then they'd go out and drink beer, and they thought I didn't know. And we had, at one church I served, they started a breakfast on Sunday morning. It was on the second Sunday. And these guys would get there at 6 o'clock in the morning and start frying up bacon, and the whole place smelled like bacon. It smelled so good. It was intoxicating. When you came to church, the whole service, I'm just drooling, and they're going, when's the sermon going to be over? And they had biscuits, and they had sauce. Some of them would go hunting, and they'd bring home deer sausage and cook it up with the eggs. And oh my gosh, pretty soon the second Sunday became our highest attended Sunday. And it wasn't the preaching. It was the food. And we talked about that yesterday. That was the crowd. But those guys had community with each other. And they also had nondescript tumblers. And I don't know what was in those tumblers. And they weren't telling. But they would do all their cooking, and they would barbecue, and sometimes they'd barbecue lunches and stuff like that, and they would come in for communion with their aprons on, smelling of smoke, and people would be like, oh, we're having lunch after church. Yeah, we're sticking around for that. You create a sense of joy and community and so forth, and there goes my alarm. Okay, I got to pull this together. What else do we got? Oh, well, I'm sorry. Dear friends, the Bible begins and it ends in a garden. In the beginning, God created a garden. God threw the stars in the sky and separated the waters from the waters, and dry land appeared, and then vegetation. And then God created fruit trees and put human beings eventually in charge of those fruit trees. And then God created fish and birds and created this absolutely gorgeous garden. And on the sixth day, let's call it the Cretaceous period, there's this explosion of life, and God creates furry Carls, and says it is good. Before there's original sin, there's original blessing. God said it is good, and then God creates human beings and puts human beings in the garden. Says, fill the earth and till the earth. I give you dominion over the air and the birds of the sea. That's wrong. The fish of the sea and the birds of the air. That you are wildlife caretakers, that God put us in charge of the garden. And yes, then we know it all goes south after that. That Cain kills Abel, and Abel's blood cries up from the earth. And when God comes to visit the earth, we put him on a cross. But I am the life that will never, never die. I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed tears before that moment. But then on Easter Sunday, that's also in a garden. When Mary and the women with spices that they had prepared go into the garden, and they think that they're going to anoint Jesus' body, and all of a sudden they stand there in an empty tomb, and they wonder what's going on. And someone comes up behind them and startles them. And they think it's the gardener. And then the passage that I think Sarah read about, the Bible ends in a garden too. This garden city that comes down from heaven, where there's no more weeping and no more tears and no more death. And behold, I make all things new again. And then there's this crystal clear river that runs through it. And there's the tree of life in this garden city, whose leaves are for the healing of the world. May your ministry be for the healing of the world. May your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Amen.